Captain Ryan West had been to many planets, seen many wars, and faced countless dangers, but nothing could have prepared him for what he encountered on the alien world of Xylora. He wasn't supposed to be there for long. It was supposed to be a simple diplomatic mission. He was to act as a protector, ensuring the safety of the human diplomats in peace talks with the Xyloran Empire. However, in a split second, everything changed. Xylora was a beautiful planet, but it had been marred by years of civil war. The air was thick with the scent of rich, alien flowers that grew in wild forests of bright purple trees. The sky was a strange mix of green and gold. The people were tall, with golden skin and silvery hair, and their eyes gleamed with an intelligence that was unmatched. Despite their beauty, the Xylorans had been trapped in a long-running war, their planet torn between factions. Today, Ryan was there as a symbol of peace, but it wouldn't last. The negotiations were taking place in the Grand Palace, a building so massive it seemed to touch the sky. Ryan stood beside the human ambassadors, keeping an eye on the proceedings. He wasn't there to speak. He was there to protect. The aliens had their own security, but Ryan knew better than to trust others with the lives of the humans in his charge. Suddenly, the palace doors burst open. In an instant, chaos erupted. The sound of blaster fire filled the air, and the walls of the palace shook. Screams echoed through the hall as soldiers in dark uniforms stormed in. They were not Xyloran, that much was clear. They were the invaders, the enemy forces that had long sought to take control of the planet. Ryan's instincts kicked in. Without thinking, he drew his weapon and took cover behind a column. His mind raced as he assessed the situation. The enemy was closing in, and the princess, their most valuable target, was nowhere to be seen. Princess Zira. Ryan had only met her a few times, but he knew who she was. She was the daughter of the Xyloran Queen, and she was the symbol of the Empire's future. If the enemy took her, the peace talks would be over, and any hope of stopping the war would be dashed. Without hesitation, Ryan leaped into action. He wasn't a diplomat. He was a soldier. His training had prepared him for moments like this. He darted from cover, firing his blaster at the invaders. The weapon hummed as it discharged, its powerful blasts knocking enemies off their feet. But it wasn't enough. They were too many. Ryan knew he had to find the princess, and fast. His eyes scanned the room. There, near the far wall, he spotted a figure running towards a side door. It was her, Princess Zira. She was unarmed and alone, her silken gown flowing behind her as she sprinted toward an escape. Ryan's heart raced, but his focus never wavered. He charged forward, dodging gunfire and taking down a few more of the invaders along the way. His muscles burned, but he kept running. As he reached the door, he saw her stumble, and he knew this was his chance. Ryan reached out, grabbing her arm and pulling her to her feet. She gasped, her silver eyes wide with shock. "What are you doing?" she demanded in a voice that, despite its command, held a hint of fear. "Getting you out of here," Ryan said, his voice firm. He didn't have time to explain. He didn't have time for anything except survival. Without waiting for her response, Ryan dragged the princess toward a back corridor, hoping to find an exit. The palace was a maze of corridors and rooms, and he had no idea where he was going. All he knew was that they had to keep moving. The invaders were close behind, and if they were caught, the consequences would be disastrous. They rounded a corner and found themselves in a small, dimly lit hallway. Ryan checked over his shoulder, making sure no one had followed them. For a moment it seemed like they were safe, but he knew better than to relax. The enemy was relentless. "Where do we go now?" Zira asked, her voice low but still filled with the authority of her royal blood. Ryan glanced around, spotting a small door at the end of the hallway. It didn't look like much, but it might be their only chance. He nodded toward it. That way. As they moved toward the door, Ryan could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. The princess was no ordinary person. She was the future of her people. Her capture could mean the end of everything the Xylorans had fought for. He had to protect her, no matter the cost. They reached the door, but before Ryan could open it, a loud explosion rocked the palace. The walls shook, and dust rained down from the ceiling. The enemy had breached the outer defenses. "We need to move," Ryan urged, pulling on the door. It opened with a creak, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. He gestured for Zira to go first, and she did, though she hesitated for a moment. Her eyes locked with his, and for a brief second he saw something in her gaze. A mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. Ryan followed her down the stairs, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. The air was thick and musty, but there was no time to think about the surroundings. They had to keep going. Every second counted. The staircase seemed to go on forever, but eventually they reached the bottom. Ryan led the way through another set of doors and into a small underground chamber. It was cold and dark, and the sound of footsteps echoed in the silence. Ryan stopped to catch his breath, his body aching from the relentless pace. Zira, too, was breathing heavily, but she stood tall, her posture still regal despite the chaos around her. She glanced at him with a mixture of admiration and confusion. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. Ryan's eyes met hers, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. He was a soldier, a protector. He didn't have time for questions, but somehow the princess's voice made him stop and think. "I'm doing this because I can," Ryan replied. "I'm doing this because you're important and I can't let you fall into their hands." Zira said nothing, but her gaze softened. She had always been surrounded by her royal guards and people who obeyed her every command. But here, with Ryan, she felt something different. She felt safe. They continued through the tunnels, each step taking them further from the palace and closer to the unknown. Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. He had saved the princess, but the real fight was just starting. Behind them, the sound of footsteps grew louder. The enemy was closing in. Ryan's grip tightened on his blaster. He wouldn't let them take her. Not now. Not ever. Ryan had never been in a situation like this before. The world of war and diplomacy he was used to was so different from the strange alien place he now found himself. The dimly lit tunnels beneath the royal palace of Xylora offered little comfort, but at least they were safe. For now. Yi and Princess Zira had been running through them for what felt like hours, though the adrenaline coursing through Ryan's veins made the time blur. Zira moved ahead of him, her long silver hair glowing faintly in the dark. Despite the danger, she carried herself with an elegance that reminded Ryan of her royal status. She didn't show fear, not outwardly, but he could tell something had shifted in her. The walls of her fortress-like demeanor were slowly starting to crack, and Ryan was beginning to see a different side of the princess. Ryan's mind kept racing. He had barely known Zira before all this happened. She had seemed so distant during the peace talks, her role as a princess seeming more like a mask than a reality. She had always carried herself with a cold, commanding air, something that made it hard for him to understand who she really was. But now, in the chaos of their escape, he was starting to see beyond the title. She was a young woman caught in a war she didn't want to fight. She had a heart beneath the royal armor. Ryan couldn't help but wonder how she had been affected by all of this. As they moved through the tunnels, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the walls, Zira turned to him. Her expression was serious, her eyes scanning the dark, her body alert.
"Where are we going?" she asked, her voice calm, though it held an edge of curiosity.
Ryan glanced around, trying to pick out any signs that would indicate a safe route. But everything here looked the same. Narrow stone walls, low ceilings, and the occasional flickering light overhead. He didn't have a plan. He was improvising, hoping they could find a way out before the enemy caught up to them.
"I don't know yet," Ryan admitted, his voice low, "but we'll keep moving."
"There has to be an exit somewhere." Zira nodded, accepting his answer, though it was clear she didn't like the uncertainty. She wasn't used to relying on anyone, least of all a human soldier who was still a stranger to her. Ryan could tell she was used to being in control of every situation, not scrambling to find a way out like this. They walked in silence for a few more minutes, the tension between them thick in the air. Every so often, Zira would glance at him, and Ryan would catch her studying him with an intensity that made him feel exposed. He didn't know what she was thinking. He wasn't sure if she thought he was the hero of the day or just a pawn in a larger game. The sound of distant footsteps reached their ears, and Ryan immediately froze, holding up his hand to signal Zira to stop. He motioned for her to get behind him, and they both pressed themselves against the cold stone of the tunnel wall. Ryan's breath was shallow, his senses alert. He could hear the unmistakable sound of enemy boots growing closer. The invaders were catching up. "Stay quiet," Ryan whispered, his voice barely audible. Zira didn't argue, though he could feel her tension rising. She knew that if they were discovered, they'd be in serious trouble. Ryan had no doubt they would kill her if they captured her, and he wasn't sure what would happen to him. His training told him to stay calm, but the thought of the princess's life hanging in the balance made it harder to focus. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and Ryan held his breath. His fingers tightened around the blaster at his side. He had already used it several times during their escape, but the enemy was still out there, hunting for them. He couldn't afford to be reckless now. He had to think quickly and keep them both safe. Just as Ryan was about to make a move, Zira spoke in a low voice.
"Why are you doing this?"
she asked again, her tone softer than before. Ryan hesitated. He had expected her to ask that question earlier, but the weight of it still felt strange to him. He had never questioned his duty. It was always clear. Protect the people you're sent to protect, and do whatever it takes to get the job done. But Zira wasn't just anyone. She was a princess, and this was a world he didn't fully understand. But still, he couldn't turn away. Not now. "I'm doing it because I have to," Ryan replied, "because I'm not going to let you die."
"Not on my watch."
Zira's eyes flickered with something, surprise perhaps. It was hard to tell. She had lived a life surrounded by warriors and royalty, but Ryan's words seemed to strike her in a way she hadn't expected. She opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of approaching voices interrupted her. Ryan motioned for her to stay silent again. He was ready. He had no choice but to be ready. The invaders were close. Too close. He carefully moved forward, peering around the corner. He could make out a group of enemy soldiers ahead, searching the area, their blasters drawn. Ryan's pulse quickened, but he didn't hesitate. He had to act fast. "Stay behind me," he whispered to Zira, his voice firm. She nodded without question, staying close to him as they carefully advanced. Ryan moved quickly, silently, his every movement calculated. As they approached the enemy soldiers, he waited for the perfect moment. Then, with one swift motion, he emerged from the shadows and fired his blaster. The first soldier went down with a cry, his body crumpling to the floor. The others scrambled, reaching for their weapons, but Ryan was faster. He fired again, taking down 2 more before they could react. The remaining soldiers didn't stand a chance. Within moments they were either dead or incapacitated, lying on the cold floor of the tunnel. Zira stared at the scene, wide-eyed. She had never seen anyone fight with such precision, such speed. Ryan didn't waste time. He simply moved on, pulling her along behind him.
"You killed them," Zira said, her voice a mix of awe and confusion. "They would have killed us," Ryan replied simply.
"This is war, princess. In times like this, there's no room for mercy." Zira didn't respond, but Ryan could feel her eyes on him as they continued to move through the tunnels. He wasn't sure what she was thinking. Maybe she was starting to understand what he had been trying to tell her all along. There were no easy choices in war, no clear right or wrong. There was only survival. They walked on, the echo of their footsteps ringing through the tunnels, and Ryan couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning. He had protected Zero once, but he knew that as long as they were on this alien planet, their safety would never be guaranteed. But one thing was certain. He wouldn't stop fighting. Not as long as she needed him. The underground tunnels of Xylora stretched endlessly before Ryan and Princess Zira. Every step they took echoed off the cold stone walls, a constant reminder of the danger that pursued them. They had been moving through these dark, hidden paths for what seemed like hours, with no clear destination in mind. The enemy soldiers were still out there, searching every corner of the palace, and Ryan knew that they couldn't stop moving. If they did, they'd be caught. Zira had said little since their encounter with the enemy soldiers. She had watched him fight with a calmness that surprised him. There had been no fear in her eyes, only a quiet determination. Ryan had expected her to be shaken, but instead, she seemed almost distant. It made him wonder what kind of life she had lived before all this.
What kind of person had she been before this war came to her doorstep? Ryan glanced over at her as they walked.
She was still as composed as ever, her face expressionless, her eyes scanning the darkness ahead. He couldn't help but admire her strength. She was no ordinary princess. She wasn't like the other royal figures Ryan had met in his travels. Zira didn't seek attention or power. She didn't wear her title like an armor. She had been forced into this role by birth, but she wore it with a quiet dignity. Yet there was a sadness in her, something hidden deep within her royal demeanor. Ryan could see it, even if she didn't show it. The weight of being a princess, the burden of being the future of her people, had to be suffocating. Ryan had never known that kind of responsibility. The closest he had come was protecting his comrades in the military, but this was different. This was the life of an entire planet hanging in the balance. And it had been thrust upon her, with no choice, no say in the matter. They reached another intersection in the tunnels, and Ryan paused, his senses alert. He hadn't heard any footsteps behind them for a while, but that didn't mean they were safe. The tunnels were a maze, and the enemy could be anywhere. He checked the map on his wrist communicator, if it still worked, and tried to get his bearings. There was no telling where these tunnels led, but the idea of getting trapped in a dead end didn't sit well with him. "We should rest for a bit," Ryan said quietly, breaking the silence.
"We've been moving for hours." Zira didn't immediately respond, but after a moment, she nodded and sat down against the wall. Ryan followed suit, taking a knee and keeping his eyes on the shadows.
He couldn't let his guard down, not even for a moment. The enemy was still out there, and they would be looking for them with everything they had. The air in the tunnels was thick with dust, and Ryan couldn't help but notice the quietness that surrounded them. It was almost as if the world had stopped moving. He glanced over at Zira, who had her eyes closed, her arms folded in front of her. She looked like she was lost in thought, her expression far away. Ryan hesitated, then spoke again. "You know, I never expected any of this."
"I was just here to keep the peace. I didn't sign up for
this." Zira opened her eyes and looked at him, her gaze steady.
"Neither did I," she said softly. "None of us did."
"The war, it came for us. We didn't ask for it." He didn't know how to respond. He had always been a soldier, used to the idea of fighting. But war was different when it was personal, when it affected people like Zira, who had no choice in the matter. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like to grow up in the middle of a war, to be trained for leadership before you even had a chance to decide who you wanted to be. "How did you end up here?" Ryan asked, breaking the silence once again. "I mean, you're a princess."
You didn't have to be here. You could have stayed in the palace, safe from all of this.
Zira's lips pressed into a thin line, and she looked away. For a moment, Ryan thought she wouldn't answer. But then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think I had a choice?" she asked, her tone bitter. "I was born into this life. I didn't ask to be the future of my people. I didn't ask to carry the weight of my mother's crown, but it was never up to me." Ryan didn't say anything, letting her words hang in the air. He had never thought of it that way. He had always viewed the royal family as something distant, something separate from the people they ruled. But Zira wasn't just a princess. She was a person, someone who had to carry the burden of her entire planet's future on her shoulders. She had no say in it. Her life had been mapped out for her from the moment she was born. "I'm sorry," Ryan said quietly. He didn't know what else to say. His words felt inadequate, but it was all he could offer. Zira turned back to him, her expression unreadable. "Don't be," she said, her voice flat.
"There's nothing to apologize for." The silence stretched between them, heavier now. Ryan knew there was so much more to her story than she was letting on.
But he didn't push her. It wasn't his place. She would tell him when she was ready. Until then, he would keep protecting her, no matter what. That was all he could do. After a few minutes, Ryan stood up and motioned for Zira to follow him.
"We need to keep moving," he said. "We can't stay here too long."
She didn't speak, but Ryan could tell she was still processing everything that had happened. They both were. They continued down the tunnel, moving as quietly as possible. The further they went, the more Ryan realized that they were heading deeper into the heart of the planet. These tunnels weren't just for escaping. They were part of something much larger. He could feel it. The air was getting colder, the walls smoother, as if they were entering a more controlled environment. Eventually, they came across another door, and this time, Ryan pushed it open cautiously. They stepped into a new room, and Ryan's breath caught. The space was enormous, larger than anything he had expected. It looked like an underground vault, filled with ancient-looking technology. The walls were covered in glowing symbols, and strange devices hummed quietly in the background. "This must be it," Ryan murmured. "The heart of Xylora." Zira stepped forward, her eyes wide with wonder. "This is the ancient archive," she said, her voice filled with awe. "I've heard of it, but I never thought I would see it in person." "What is this place?" "This is where our people stored their knowledge, the secrets of our civilization," Zira explained. "It's been hidden away for centuries. But if we can access it, we might be able to turn the tide of the war." This was what they had been looking for, the key to saving her people. He had no idea how they would do it, but one thing was clear. This was their chance. He turned to Zira, his voice serious. "We're not out of danger yet, but if we can get to that information, we might have a fighting chance." Zira looked at him, determination filling her gaze. "Then we'll get it," she said, her voice unwavering. Ryan nodded. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about winning. And with Zira by his side, he knew they had a chance. The ancient vault beneath the surface of Xylora was nothing like Ryan had imagined. The air was heavy with the scent of forgotten things, dust settling on rows of strange machines and technology, unlike anything he had seen before. The glowing symbols on the walls flickered like stars, and the soft hum of the devices in the room added an eerie feel to the silence. It was as if time had stopped here, waiting for someone to rediscover its secrets. Ryan stood still for a moment, taking it all in. The weight of what they had just found settled over him. They weren't just in an ancient archive. They had stumbled upon the heart of Xylora's lost history. This place held the answers to everything. The knowledge, the technology, the power of an entire civilization. If they could unlock its secrets, it could change the course of the war. He turned to Zira, who was already moving forward, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and determination. She had always been the composed princess, but now, in this moment, she looked different. It was as if a part of her had been awakened, something deeper, something older.
"We have to find the central core," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "It's where the most important information is stored."
If we can access it, we can use the data to our advantage. Ryan nodded. "Lead the way." The room was vast, and the vault seemed endless, filled with rows upon rows of forgotten knowledge. There were holographic screens suspended in the air, showing shifting patterns of light and symbols. Some of the technology was still functional, though many of the systems had long since powered down. The place felt like a tomb, holding the memories of a people who had once been powerful, but now seemed like a distant memory. Ryan followed Sira as she moved with purpose, her every step measured. She didn't hesitate, even though the space was unfamiliar. This was her home, her people's legacy. She was determined to understand it, to use it to save her world. "I've studied these systems," she said as they walked.
I know how to unlock the core. It's just a matter of finding the right terminal. Ryan watched her carefully, admiring her confidence.
She was a warrior in her own right. She might not have been trained for combat in the same way he was, but the way she carried herself now, determined, focused, made him realize how strong she truly was. They came to a large central pillar in the middle of the room. It was covered in symbols that glowed faintly, casting a soft light on the stone floor beneath them. Zira approached it with reverence, her fingers brushing over the glowing symbols as she activated a console embedded in the side of the pillar. The symbols on the pillar shifted, rearranging themselves in a complex pattern. Ryan stood back, giving Zira the space she needed. He knew this was her moment. If they succeeded, they could turn the tide of the war. If they failed, Ryan pushed the thought out of his mind. He wouldn't let them fail. He couldn't. "Almost there," Zira muttered, her voice a mix of frustration and concentration. Her fingers flew over the console, pressing buttons and swiping across the touch-sensitive surface. The symbols flickered faster, changing rapidly as the system seemed to respond to her commands. Ryan's heart raced. They were so close now. He could feel it in his bones. The console beeped, and the pillar in front of them shifted. A low rumble filled the room as the stone began to move, revealing a hidden chamber beneath it. A holographic display flickered to life above the opening, casting a bright blue light across the room. It showed a map of the planet, overlaid with glowing lines of data and coordinates. Zira stepped forward, her face illuminated by the light. She stared at the display, her eyes widening as the data streamed across the screen. "This is it," she whispered. "This is the core." Ryan stepped closer, trying to make sense of the information displayed before him. There were maps, charts, and alien symbols, too many things to process all at once. But one thing stood out to him. A large portion of the data was highlighted in red, marked as classified. It seemed to be a series of military tactics, maps of key strategic locations, and weapon systems. This wasn't just information about the planet. It was information that could change the course of the war. Zira tapped a few buttons, and the holographic screen zoomed in on a specific location on the map. It was marked as a high-security facility deep within the heart of the enemy's territory. "That's where they're building their weapon," Zira said, her voice hardening.
"We have to destroy it."
Ryan looked at her, the gravity of her words sinking in. They were no longer just running for their lives.
They had a mission, a purpose. They were going to stop the weapon that could end everything.
"How do we get there?" Ryan asked, his voice steady. Zira didn't hesitate. "We'll need to contact my mother. She can send reinforcements. With this information, we can launch an attack that will cripple their forces. We'll end this war." Ryan felt a surge of hope. They had the chance to end this conflict if they acted fast enough.
But he also knew that it wouldn't be easy. The enemy wasn't going to give up their weapon without a fight. Zira stepped back from the console, her face set with determination. "We can't waste any more time."
We have to get out of here and contact my mother.
"Let's go." They turned to leave, but as they moved toward the exit, a sudden noise stopped them. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Footsteps that were too close. Someone was coming. Ryan held up his hand, signaling for Zira to stop. He listened carefully, his eyes scanning the room. The sound was getting louder. Someone was approaching the vault.
Zira's face paled.
"It's them!" The invaders. Ryan cursed under his breath. They had no time to waste. They had to get out now. He grabbed Zira's arm and pulled her toward a side passage he had spotted earlier. They sprinted down the narrow corridor, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Ryan didn't know how far they had to go, but he knew that every second counted. They had the information they needed, but they couldn't let it fall into enemy hands. As they turned another corner, Ryan heard voices behind them. Louder now. They were being hunted. The enemy was close, and they weren't going to stop until they had what Ryan and Zira had found. They ran faster, pushing themselves harder. The narrow passage seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in around them. Ryan's breath was coming in quick, shallow bursts. He could feel Zira beside him, her presence a steady force in the chaos. She wasn't slowing down. She was as determined as he was to make it out alive. Then, up ahead, they saw light.
The exit. Ryan's heart skipped a beat.
They were almost there, but just as they reached the end of the tunnel, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was one of the enemy soldiers blocking their only escape. Ryan's instincts kicked in. Without thinking, he drew his blaster and fired. The soldier collapsed to the ground, but more were coming. He could hear their voices growing louder, closing in on them.
"We're not done yet," Ryan said, his voice low but filled with resolve.
"Get to the exit. I'll cover you." Zira didn't argue. She bolted forward, her footsteps echoing as she rushed toward the light. Ryan followed close behind, his blaster ready. They had come this far. They couldn't stop now. The exit was just ahead. They could make it. They had to make it. With one final burst of speed, they reached the doorway. Ryan turned to look behind him, just in time to see the enemy soldiers closing in. But he didn't wait. He pushed forward, following Zira into the unknown. The war was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, Ryan felt like they had a fighting chance.